Welcome to the Racially Responsible Podcast. This show is designed to guide, support, and challenge us as white people to be actively anti-racist and step up to work for a racially equitable future. I'm your host, Rory Geller Muhammad, a licensed clinical social worker, therapist, and founder of the organization You Power Change. I'm also a white woman that grew up with a sibling of color, a white mom raising multiracial kids in a multiracial family, and strive to be a role model of what it looks like to be an anti-racist white person. If this resonates with you, I hope you will join the Racially Responsible Podcast community on Facebook to continue the conversation, ask questions, and join us to support each other on next steps. To creating a racially equitable future, let's get started. I want to welcome Rebecca Greenidge to the show. I'm really excited that you're here today, Rebecca. Thank you so much for coming on.
Yes. Hey, it's going to be great.
Yes. So I was wondering if you could tell the audience a little bit about who you are, your background, and the anti-racism work that you do.
Yeah. So my name's Rebecca Greenidge. I'm co-founder of JORE Consulting, JORE Consulting, and co-founded it with my husband. I am white, identify as female, and the anti-racist work that I do primarily at this point is with white people. I have developed a really deep love for white people engaging in anti-racism and wanting to do a lot of community coalition development. So lots of different people who have different experiences of what it means to be white. I'm really curious about that. I'm curious about how we come together to create an anti-racist subculture that could really suit the needs within our white community. And so that's largely the work that I do, as well as just, I think, speaking to institutions who are struggling with how white dominant norms are influencing their institution and what they want to do about that. So I often come into institutional spaces to discuss with leaders around identifying how that's happening and try to make some plans for counteracting that influence.
That's awesome. And stuff, I don't think that we don't always hear that about like this type of work and what this looks like in that way. So I think that's awesome.
Yeah.
Awesome that you're doing that.
Yeah, I'm kind of a unicorn in some ways.
So I think it's always helpful for people that are doing this work and getting involved, or white people, to hear about other people's journeys of how they got involved with anti-racism work, what that looks like. Could you share a little bit about how you first got started doing this work and what that looked like for you in the beginning of your journey?
Yeah, sure. So I was raised in a small town in Eastern Oregon, and I remember the first time that I feel like I can remember noticing race was when I was, I think, about in the second grade. And some little girls that I used to go to school with would have Friday night sleepovers. And I was never invited. And I finally got up the courage to ask if I could come to a Friday night sleepover. And I was told, no, you can't come because you don't belong. You need to go back to the reservation. And I'm dark skin complected or olive complected. I have really dark hair, really dark eyes. And I used to wear my hair in like the classic 80s, like with bangs and then 2 long braids. And I wore them in braids all the time. And my mom tells me that within a day or two of that I told her that I wanted to stop wearing my hair in braids. And I wanted to have her put my hair in a ponytail instead. And that's what alerted her that something had gone awry, and asked me about why that was. And I ended up telling her the story. And she ended up telling me something to, just ignore them. They're silly girls. But I don't have any recollection of us having a very deep conversation about race at that point. And I feel like there have been many times in my life that because of my coloring that I've been misidentified as something other than white. And I think that that's given me a lens into what that experience might be like for Indigenous, Black, and brown people. However, it was often confusing to me. And as a child, I feel like there was a lot of times that I noticed injustice and would ask questions about that, and was raised with a colorblind ideology without my parents being intentional about that. I don't believe that they wanted to intentionally teach me colorblindness any more than I think, the white anti-racist parents that I'm working with now that don't want to raise their kids with colorblindness, but we still have colorblindness. Our children are still answering to the question of, does race matter in relationships? They're still answering, no, it doesn't matter. So I think we have to be really careful about that, but also really gracious towards one another to recognize that we may not intend to do those things or to intend to have those impacts, and yet they're still there. How do we understand that that was our impact, even if that wasn't what we intended to do or how we intended to raise our children? So fast forward to 19, I moved to Portland, Oregon, and I'm living a completely segregated life. I work with white people. My friends are white people. I live around white people. I go to church with white people. And I end up meeting my now spouse at the age of 27 or 28. And I think I was 27. And he identifies as Black West Indian. And within the first 2 weeks of us meeting each other, he gave me 2 books. And one of them that was really deeply profound for me and kind of began this journey was a book by Juwanja Kunjufu named Countering the Conspiracy to Destroy Black Boys. And in the first page of that book, the very first words are the definition of genocide. And it goes through a 1.5-page bullet point list of how we're enacting genocide within our US school systems on 4th grade Black boys. And I threw the book across the room and I called Jomo and I said, what? How is this possible? Like, this can't be real. I felt like I was, like in the Matrix situation.
Right.
And often refer back to that, like, okay, blue pill, red pill, like, which are you going to take at this point? And he told me he would love that I referenced that because he loves the Matrix. But he said, I don't know why you're calling me. You need to keep reading. We have no future if you don't keep reading. And I kept reading and I really haven't stopped. And so I kept reading, kept learning, did all of the classic like silence, fear, watching social media posts go really awry really fast and just stalking the posts and trying to learn, but terrified of putting myself into those conversations, and have made all of the mistakes. Then, became the white social justice warrior that utilized the weapons of whiteness without recognizing that that's what I was doing, even in my activism. And so, when I would do various things where I would engage, I would show up and demand perfectionism. I would show up and dehumanize others. I now kind of look at that and go like, okay, like part of what it looks like to be socialized in white dominance is to be socialized for weakness, to believe that someone else is to blame for why the world is the way it is or why you find yourself in the location that you find yourself. And those that are most vulnerable to the narrative of racial difference would blame Indigenous, Black, and Brown people. They are ultimately the target of that system. And when we believe that, then we do a lot of harm there. And when we start to stop believing that and start to make that first transition to where we're no longer blaming Indigenous, Black, and Brown people, I think it's very natural, or what I often see, what I did and what the others doing, is to then kind of wag our finger at other white people. And what I think we would do well to do at that juncture is to pause and say, why do I feel like somebody else is to blame? What is it about me and what is happening in me why I'm finding myself having these urgings to blame somebody? And if I'm no longer willing to blame Indigenous, Black, and Brown people, who am I willing to blame? So I think that that's where that I come to the juncture that I'm at today, which is to engage the white community and say, how do we build connection across difference? That not all members of the white community have the same set of advantages. Not all members of the white community have experienced the same types of socialization or in the same ways. Some people got that in their family. Some people got it more in school. Some people got it more in community. So how is it happening for people? And then what are we going to do about that? And so now I find myself at this place of really being very deeply curious about how socialization functions and how we roll that back, so that we can see ourselves inside of the system of white dominance and then start to see ourselves outside of it.
Right, right. And I love just how like you're able to kind of share your personal experiences and where they fit within that, right? And how like kind of that looks for your journey. And so when we think of just such an important part of parents having tools to be able to have these conversations, right, with kids, like your example you gave when you were a child, being able to, for our personal relationships, that we have the ability, the knowledge, the tools that we need to navigate these different dynamics that are coming up within our personal relationships.
Yeah.
And really what that looks like. Thank you for, I really appreciate you being able to share that. Because I think a lot of that's really, everyone, of course, like has their own experiences and situations, but I think that's really helpful in kind of pointing out like, this is what it looks like, right? These are specific examples of what that looks like.
Yeah, I think you bring up a good point that we're often missing in white anti-racist subculture is that consciousness cannot be the end all be all. To learn about a thing is not the same thing as dismantling a thing. And so I think that when we talk about those experiences of our own childhood and then how or our own, young adult life, the point before we walked through this threshold, because I think all white people come across this same threshold of, unless you were raised under a rock, you've been socially conditioned to uphold the system of white dominance. And so when you come to that threshold of going, holy shit, I don't want this to be the way that this is. I don't want to live like that. Or I feel some sense of guilt around my participation in that then what does it look like to keep taking a step forward on the other side? And I think too often we prioritize this intellectualism around, well, you just have to know the thing. You just have to be able to talk the language. You need to be able to use the jargon. And if you use the jargon, then that's operating as a shield. And what I'm more curious about is how do we pair consciousness raising or learning about a thing with skill development, the ability to break down a thing. And so then we don't have, highly knowledgeable people, but low skilled people, which I often say to people that I'm facilitating with, if you have high consciousness and low skills, that difference between there is your vulnerability to self-righteousness that's ultimately rooted in frustration because you know a thing, but you don't know what to do with that knowledge.
Yes. That I think is such an important thing to point out, right? I think there's so many people operating in that space right now.
Right. For real. And I did. That's the only reason why I can recognize it, because I did a lot of consciousness raising so that I felt like I was sufficiently changed to engage conversations that scared me. And so then when they scared me, then I would have these physiological reactions. My heart's pounding, I'm sweating, I'm getting really enraged. And then I would just bark at people and I would just do all the, let me get up on my soapbox and preach to you about all the things that you don't know that I know. And what I had to end up coming to a place of realizing was, am I more concerned about protecting my ego or am I more interested in being effective?
Yes.
And that drew me to say, then you need to develop some different skills here because this isn't working.
Yeah, that's a great point. Really great. So what are some personal or family challenges that you've come across doing this work, if there has been anything that came up for you that you'd be willing to share with us?
all the personal family. So at the juncture where I became a parent, we adopted our children. And when we got them, they were fourth grade and kindergarten. And so I was deeply at that place of wagging my finger at all other white people, didn't think that I was participating in this at all. And if you recall, the very first book I read was about fourth grade Black boys. Well, sure enough, my sons are both Black and our older was a fourth grader. And so that first year, it just played out exactly like how the book said it would play out. And he was suspended 5 times in 4 months. And I went into mama bear mode and doing all the defense of him and all of, the pushing at the schools. And I, at some point, as my heels were clicking down the hallway to go and make demands of principals and teachers and just walk my way in there and push past rules, I realized the only way that I was doing that was because I was a white mother. That Black mothers did not have the same access to advocate for their being harmed to the same degree, if not worse, than my kids were. And that's where I first started thinking about weaponized whiteness and about how, if I'm utilizing the same tactics of white dominance against white people for the purpose of liberating my children, it ultimately, I think, entrenched in me and entrenched the white people that I was pushing in our internalized white dominance. I felt righteous. I felt like I was, to quote some of Tim Okun's article, White Supremacy Culture, I felt like I was the only one. I felt like I was doing it perfectly. There was definitely a binary thinking for me. And as I engaged that and then kind of started to look at it and go, okay, well, this isn't going to be the way that Black mothers can advocate for their children. And so how would I do this? Still advocating for my sons, but how would I do this in a way that would set down those weapons? And as I started to do that, so then my finger started to point towards me. And I realized just how culpable I was. I realized I often use the word ghastly, like when you start to face yourself at that level.
Yeah.
It's a very painful place. And what I realized was because I had never really faced my internalized white dominance, I had just gone from blaming Black people and brown people and Indigenous people to blaming white people who I saw were the enemy, but I couldn't possibly be the enemy, that I then had to face actually my participation. And that changed my partnership with my partner. It changed how I parent. It changed how I engage the white community. It changed how I do a lot of things. But it was a personally very painful place because I had to face the fact that I was harming the people who I loved the most and who I had put on their shoulders, that I was doing this work for my partner and my children. And I had to realize how unfair that was, that I needed to do this work because it was part of reclaiming my humanity. I needed to do this work because it was the right thing to do. I needed to do this work because the white community has a deep problem that it's not facing. And if I'm unwilling to do that, how dare I call anybody else to do something that I'm unwilling to traverse?
Right.
And so I started to I really love Emergent Strategies by Adrienne Maree Brown, because I really love how her connection around fractals and saying that, I think the quote is, transform yourself to transform the world. If I'm not willing to go there, if I'm not willing to go to those really personally painful places, then how in the world would I expect the white community to? And that's what I want the white community to do. So I needed to be able to go there myself.
Right.
Impact on white family members. I've lost a lot of family members because family is who you practice this on first when you have no skills.
Right.
Friends are who you practice on first. So I, as well as I think many white people that engage this conversation, lost a lot of relationships. I'm really sad about that. I'm really grieved about that. I have made several attempts to try to repair those relationships, and I still hold a lot of hope that at some point they will be able to.
Yeah.
They're wounded relationships.
Yes.
Because I was so focused on wagging my finger at other people instead of looking at me and inviting people to come along where I was going.
And I think other people can learn so much from that, like just from you sharing that, right? Different ways of kind of approaching that, and how can maybe the two and two go in hand, right? I think a lot of times, like relationships, how can it maybe be an opportunity to strengthen relationships and do this work, right? It's not separate from doing this work, right? That are there ways that we can have these conversations so that we're strengthening the relationship while we're also all learning together in a way of what this looks like, right? And what this change looks like and what we need to be doing.
Yeah.
But it's hard.
Yeah. And it's hard when you're raising Black or brown children and you're a white person.
Yes.
Because I think we have to consider safety. We have to consider who are Black and brown or Indigenous children safe around.
Yes.
And there might be people that, by the context of how we expected to do family, whether that's blood family or whether that's chosen family, that people who we thought would be in relationship with our children and people who expected relationship with our children, that when we find out that they are not willing to engage in safety making for Black and brown children, that's where I think a line does need to be drawn.
Yes.
I think that's what started as my line being drawn was around safety making, but I lacked the skills to be able to communicate that effectively and lovingly.
Right.
That invited change and growth so that we could come back together.
Yeah.
And so I have regrets, but I also know that at the end of the day, my children experience less harm because of prioritizing safety making. And I think that white people, I think that just brings me to a point that I talk about with a lot of people, is that what cost are we willing to pay as white people doing this work? You know, what are we willing to lose? What laws are we willing to break? Enslaving African bodies was legal at one point. So for those who refuse to do that or who broke laws to free people, what laws are we willing to break now? Are we actually skilled at identifying what safe is?
Right.
By somebody else's definition? Will we hear that? If Black and brown people say, look, this is unsafe, and I had to listen to the stories of many transracially adopted people who were like, look, this was not safe for me.
Yeah.
And I was the place that could choose that. I sat in the position to say whether I would allow unsafety to continue or whether I would expect change for the purpose of safety of Black children.
Right.
So it's hard. It's nuanced, right? Like it's not.
It is. It definitely is. Yeah. I know with a lot of the families that I work with, I mean, one of the things, of course, is putting up those boundaries, and you have to create safety, right? As a parent, that's your job, is to create safety for your child, right? As much as you like everything that you can. And I think the other part is also, how do we also, that this process is, have that boundary? And is there any opportunities for connection and still working for that change with those family members? And it's hard. It is. It's nuanced. It's challenging, and not everybody's open to it. And what does that look like? And I think sometimes that this kind of like family therapy and just the way that like family therapy works, right? How can even some of those strategies be put into some of these spaces, right? Of what that looks like, not necessarily sitting in a room with therapy, but what engagement strategies or what things are there to kind of engage some of these family members to kind of, how do we get that light bulb to go off of like, how do they need to be in a way, right? How do they need to show up so that our children can thrive, right? Like, what does that look like? I really appreciate, I think it's great because a lot of times these things are hard to talk about. And so I think a lot of times people don't always talk about it because it's hard. And so I appreciate you kind of sharing this and being able to bring it up, because a lot of people are going through this. I feel like it's unfortunately so common that this is happening. And so what are the tools that we need as parents? What are the tools that we need as daughters, as sons, as sisters, as brothers, as aunts and uncles, right? Like, what are the tools that we need within family structures to also be able to do this work? I wanted to also ask you, what advice you have for people who are early on in their journey, right? So maybe for listeners who are asking, like, where do I start? Or those who are also maybe not even starting the beginning, but kind of like feeling stuck on their anti-racism journey. And like, they know they want to do more, but they're not sure, like, where do I start? Where do I go? How do I do this?
Yeah. So I think my advice to early journeyers is to find community for themselves around people who are engaged in this similar conversation. I've been researching recently what causes people to become radicalized into white nationalism and what causes them to become de-radicalized, or what those journeys are. And I just read a book by Christian Picciolini, who became radicalized as a skinhead at the age of 14 and then left the movement after 8 years at the age of 22, and has spent his adult life then helping people who are de-radicalizing. And in his book, I think he just had another book come out, but the first book that I read came out a few years ago. And he talks about that he was not radicalized by ideology. He was radicalized by a sense of belonging. And I think that everyone needs a sense of belonging. That's become really clear to me, like from a very basic human need.
Yes.
And so as you engage white anti-racism, you need a sense of belonging. And he talks about identity, community, and purpose. So who are you as a white person? Who do you belong to? And what's your reason or your why for being on this earth, or your why for why you're engaging anti-racism? And we need to do that work to understand, but also get kind of rooted. And I can't stress enough the community aspect of it. I pursued white anti-racism for many years in almost entirely isolation. I was doing a lot of reading, a lot of studying, not having relationships, losing a lot of relationships. All of a sudden, white friends, white people that I had been around for a long time were just like, oh, there's Rebecca again, talking about race again. I just lost a lot of relationships and I became deeply isolated. And when I found community again, at that point, I kind of thought, well, I'm not going to be able to have relationships with white people. And then I met a few really key people who have continued to journey with me for ever since I met them. And what that changed in me was it all of a sudden made me go, oh, I grow a lot quicker when I have other white people who are pursuing this work. It makes more sense to me. I have a place to belong, right? And now I have a deeper understanding about Resmaa Menakem, who wrote My Grandmother's Hands, talks about cultural somatic practices and his belief that we cannot heal each other across race. So there's something deeply connecting, inspiring, propelling, healing about being connected with other white people doing this work. And if we don't have that, isolation will breed fear. It will breed loneliness. It'll breed overwhelm. who am I? I'm just this little lone person. Shoot, when you start, getting together with lots of people and you start feeling a sense of coalition, what it could look like for the white community to have an anti-racist subculture that's healthy and vibrant, where we don't all have the exact same types of ways that we engage our anti-racism practices, but we come together and we learn from one another and we push one another, we give feedback and we rely upon feedback. We feel like that's essential to our growth. Shoot, that's where we will start to feel more powerful. That's where we will start to go, we can change this in our community and start to believe that white dominance could lose its hold. But without that, there's too much isolation. People who've been on their journey for a long time that are feeling stuck, I think, how can you make a goal? How can you set regular goals, small things? I've been studying also curiosity right now because curiosity is such a propellant for learning and for change. And so is your curiosity alive and well? What are you curious about? Both about yourself and how you're showing up, but also about things that you don't yet know about. What are you avoiding? Where are you disconnected? Are you disconnected from your ancestral lines? For me, I didn't want to look at that for a really long time. And so it took me a long time in my anti-racist journey to do ancestral work and go back and find what my people had been up to. Why did they come here? And what they had been up to once they got here? And where did we lose our cultural and linguistic histories and become white? And what did we give up in order to become white? And how does that play into now how I behave today, which it does. So I think just like, what's the next thing? What are you curious about? If you're finding that you're not very curious, then how do you start to breed curiosity in yourself? I find for me, the thing when I start to get less curious is I pick up new subjects that I've never, ever known anything about before. So, and a lot of times how I do that, this is just a silly, like practical for me, but I do that through like YouTube videos. So like for a while, I was really interested in reptiles. So I started following like reptile people and I learned about reptiles. And then I became curious in hairdressing. Like, what does it look like to perm and cut and style hair? Like, these are not conversations about race, but it's things that like spur my curiosity. So then when I'm engaging in a conversation about race, I can be curious. I can be curious about the person I'm talking to. I can be curious about why I'm feeling some kind of way. I can be curious about something I don't yet know. And that's, I feel like, is impacting our community. And then I can go study those things. And every time we engage that curiosity, we breed curiosity. It reseeds itself. We can kind of live there.
I think that's both great advice, right? The curiosity part as well as the community. And I would just say, so for people who are maybe like, how do I find this community? Like, where do I go? Or is there any tips that you would have as like, how could I find other white people doing this work?
Yeah, so I think to push back at fear is the first place. And I think that because I recognize myself as I'm subject to revisionist history, just like anybody is. But when I think back to the beginning, I did a lot of stalking conversations because I was afraid, not being vulnerable, trying to pretend, trying to learn the words, using the words, dropping, certain jargon. And now at this point in my journey, 13 years later, I'm like, can I have a conversation about race without using any jargon?
Yeah.
And I push myself to not use any jargon because jargon creates in-group, out-group. And so then that's how we start to feel better about ourselves. It kind of soothes our fear a little bit. But I think, if you find that you see anyone who makes a quick one-off comment about something political that you kind of connect with, or if you see, I know for you, like you work with a lot of white parents that are raising children of color. So you see another parent at your school that has a Black or brown child.
Right.
That's where you go and you just be vulnerable. You push past your fear and you just go, I think I'm really scared about my impact on my child. And I want to learn more. Or I've been afraid to reach out to you because I feel like I have to pretend like I have all my shit together. Or I think it would be really nice for me to have a friend who has some understanding of what it's like to be a white person raising a child of color. Just something that pushes past our fear a little bit of being seen and being known.
Right.
And the fear that we're inadequate in that.
Right.
And engage there because vulnerability creates the spot where we can connect. Like it's kind of the breeding ground. I talk a lot about soil. I think I talked about this the last time we were talking about how I think about soil as like this place, and what kind of soil do we need to gather or prepare in our own lives so that we can grow the kind of things that we want to grow.
Yes, that's a great analogy. Yes.
And I think vulnerability helps us create the kind of soil to where we could grow as white people doing this work.
Thank you. Rebecca, this has been wonderful, wonderful. Thank you so much. I really appreciate learning from you, hearing your story, and just you being able to share everything that you're sharing and the work that you're doing. So important, so amazing. And I just want to thank you so much for being part of the podcast.
You are so welcome. Thank you for having me on. I really appreciate it.
Thank you for joining us for today's episode of the Racially Responsible Podcast. I hope you participate in our Facebook group to continue the conversation, share your thoughts, ask questions, and suggest future topics you would like to hear discussed on the show. I like to end each episode with encouraging each of us to think about one action step, small or big, that we could take today to help us move in the direction of creating a racially equitable future. If you feel comfortable, share your action step in our Facebook group to inspire and encourage others and receive support, because we know action steps aren't always easy. Don't forget to check out the show notes, and I hope you join us for our next episode. Until next time.